How a Romance Novel Saved the Galaxy by Ariana Derrote. Chapter 61. Concordia 2, Obi-Wan 4. Obi-Wan opened his mouth to respond to Corinth's statement, but was forced to run to the sink at the end of the cell. He threw up some bile, then used the water from the faucet to clean out his mouth and get a drink. The effort of swallowing it down made him queasy. "They really gave you a lot. You wake up during the trip or something?" asked Zar. If he had, Obi-Wan didn't remember it. "I don't know." "Well, your wristband will be lots of rust and fluids," said Zar in a poorly imitated Coruscant accent. His sister giggled. Corinth glared at them. "Do whatever you need to do, Obi-Wan," he said kindly. "But we likely only have a few minutes before morning muster. It's probably going to seem harsh. I know it did for me when I got here. So just follow what we do, mouth along when you don't know the words, and stand straight and keep your eyes focused on a spot in front of you." "And don't cock it up for us," said Yor scornfully. "We're halfway to first rank, so if you set our progress back—" She held up a fist. Mari rolled his eyes. "Newbies always set their squads back, Yor. They're trying to make us hate him for losing us some points. Don't let them win." He turned to Obi-Wan. "They make us punish you if you do something, but no hard feelings, okay? What they make us do is different from what we want to do. Remember that." Obi-Wan slowly nodded, not quite sure what was going on. This was a lot more complicated than waking up a slave on Bandamir, but at least his goal was the same. Escape. "Forgive me for asking, but why do all of you look more tired than I feel?" "There are drills and alarms all night," said Corinth. "And they never turned the lights off, so our circadian rhythms are all out of whack," explained Mario. "But why?" Corinth shrugged and opened his mouth to say more when an ear-piercing klaxon went off. The door slid open. Obi-Wan filed out after his squad, resolving to behave until he figured out where the exits were. Far to his left, he saw a bare rock wall over the heads of several other squads in identical bodysuits. Everyone was going right, so he assumed there wasn't an obvious exit in that direction. On the far right side of the corridor, there was a strange hierarchy for lining up. Some squads got filed through a vertical hole cut in the rock with a ladder on one side. An actual adult member of Death Watch in armor was there, checking off something on their pad when each person went through, probably names or squads. But a few proud-looking squads were waiting at the side and got to use the lift as it went back and forth. Another Death Watch member was manning the lift controls and taking notes on their pad. When Obi-Wan attempted to shuffle sideways to see the lift controls, which were partially blocked by the Verd's arm, he got a sharp elbow from Zare, who was behind him. "Eyes straight!" he hissed. Obi-Wan complied, but reached out with the Force instead, trying to get a sense of their guards. He had had ample practice in focusing through Force-muffling Beskar in the past week. The one checking off names for the tunnel ladder was bored and sleepy. The one manning the lift was alert, almost hyperactively so, and was longing for an excuse to shoot something. Obi-Wan made a mental note of the person's armor so he wouldn't try to escape around them. Judging by the ore surrounding them, and considering what Jango had told him last week, he was probably in one of the Beskar mines on Concordia. If that was the case, the lift was almost certainly an exit. The question was if it was the only one. They climbed through the ladder quickly, not pausing on what looked like a second level of barracks, but going up to a third level. There was a fourth level above, but it had a hatch keeping it closed. This level also was barracks, but the doors were decorated. Some were open with Death Watch members lounging inside. Obi-Wan got elbowed by Zare again when he slowed to look around. They went in the direction away from the lift and the ladder. These barracks had another ladder on the far end before a closed fire door. Did it lead outside? They went up another level with yet another Death Watch member counting them. This level had a wide room filled with square tables. The smell of food was both enticing and made his stomach a bit queasy. Obi-Wan followed his squad to a table near the back of the room. They had to stand at attention next to their seats despite there being food on the tables. Surreptitiously looking around, there was a very obvious divide going on in the room. Squads at the front of the room had more than just protein cubes and ration bars on their plates. They were also wearing bodysuits of different colors, and many had pieces of armor. Was this the first rank his squad had mentioned? The two exits on either end of the room had a member of Death Watch in front of them, but at least two more were patrolling the room, making notes on pads. There was no talking, though Obi-Wan noted some hand signs occasionally. Once the last squad was through the ladder, a hatch was closed, leaving just the fire doors on either side as exits. One of the first-rank squad's leaders got up and faced the room. "Kirtsad!" Obi-Wan's mouth dropped open in shock as everyone shouted the word for Death Watch in Mandoa. "Biskogram!" Armor. "Kode!" Glory. "Akan!" Obi-Wan thought that meant war or warfare, but he wasn't sure. "Mandokar!" The right stuff to be Mandalorian. "Mandalore!" The leader. Then Death Watch again, followed by "Anvikuyan me!" All help us survive. It dawned on him that this was a bastardized form of the raison d'être, the 6 tenets that every Mandalorian swore, only it was missing family clan, the language, self-defense, and education. The first-rank leader started the chant a second time, and this time Obi-Wan was elbowed by Yora to mouth along. He stubbornly kept his mouth shut during the Death Watch, War, and Glory parts, but said the rest and ignored the animosity that Yora and Zar were radiating. Once they had chanted the whole thing a third time, it was time for announcements. The top squad points were given. Squads which had improved were encouraged, while glares and jeers were directed at squads who hadn't. The bottom 2 squads were forbidden breakfast and told to report immediately for cleaning duties. Obi-Wan was dismayed to see that the 2 squads had quite young children on them who looked both exhausted and resigned. "What?" he started to whisper, but got another elbow for his trouble. The announcements were finished, so they were finally given permission to sit down and eat. Obi-Wan wasn't feeling hungry, considering his lingering nausea, but he couldn't afford to pass up sustenance on his 4th day of not eating. The 3 protein cubes and half a ration bar weren't nearly enough to fill his stomach. The food did send it roiling again, so there was that. They were given maybe 10 minutes to eat before the first-rank squads climbed up the ladder somewhere. Meanwhile, his squad and all the other second ranks bussed the first-rank trays, then their own. One of the cleaning squads was at the back of the room, ready to wash the dishes. The other had disappeared while Obi-Wan was eating. Surprisingly, a table with an embedded holoprojector was pulled into the center of the room, and an adult Death Watch member, helmet off, took up a position beside it. What followed was what Obi-Wan would have normally called a fascinating lecture on Mandalorian history if it hadn't been delivered with a particular Death Watch spin. It was disturbing to hear someone speak admiringly about the near genocide of the Cathar and the actions of Dr. Demagog, whose torture and experiments on children had earned every future Mandalorian who mistreated children the derogative term Demagoga. It was a good thing that all these kidnapped children were new Mandalorians, since they didn't protest how backwards it was for any Mandalorian to be glossing over the Doctor's actions. Obi-Wan resolved to teach the word to his squad and others here as soon as possible. In addition to the disturbing subject matter, they also weren't allowed to relax while listening to the lecture. Every few minutes, the Death Watch member would bark out, "Get the Duger!" and all of them would have to repeat verbatim whatever they had last said. Everyone around him looked tired and sleep-deprived, but the order to repeat meant that no one got more than a minute or 2 to rest their eyes. There certainly was no rest after the lesson. They were herded toward the ladder, going up again. The ladder opened into a very large underground room, a vent high up in the ceiling. In some ways, it reminded Obi-Wan of a training salle back in the temple. There was a balcony to his right, which held a few watching Death Watch members, and various zones of activity marked out in crude lines of paint rather than the artistic patterns of the temple floors. One area contained a blaster range, another an obstacle course, another a sparring arena, currently occupied by the first rank. His squad was directed towards the blaster range along with several others. When it was his turn, he calmly shot the exact center of the targets, then went back to trying to look around the room without looking like he was. That earned him his first smiles from the siblings, Yora and Zar. Corinth clapped him on the back in excitement. Good shooting earned the squad points, apparently. The first rank filed back down into the mess. Second rank kept training, though each squad was tossed a few ration bars to share. They were sent to do combat drills and other exercises. Obi-Wan had wondered why Death Watch would keep everyone sleep-deprived and exhausted, but it gradually became clear. Despite still feeling nauseous and a bit out of it, Obi-Wan kept up easily while relying on the Force, but the rest of the children there were suffering. Every mistake they made due to sleep deprivation was punished harshly, either with push-ups, laps around the room, often carrying heavy weights, or squatting near the wall in a punishing stance that made the children's legs shake. When one member of a squad faltered, the entire squad was punished. Oddly, once they'd endured the punishment, the Death Watch trainers were friendlier, offering praise for being proper Mandalorians. Obi-Wan saw more than one kid stand straighter and look proud at enduring the harsh conditions. It left Obi-Wan feeling shaky inside. He'd been warned that Death Watch was kidnapping children and brainwashing them, but somehow he'd pictured them just beating children until they gave in. This was much more effective. Throughout it all, he was keeping his eyes on the 2 large fire doors on either side of the room. They had a Death Watch guard and were opened often, as this seemed to be a regular throughway for the adult Death Watch members. The exercises brought them close to the door on the far side, opposite the balcony area. When it slid open, the scent of fresh air beneath ion engine wash was unmistakable. He needed to see. His squad was running laps, and the guard at the door was growing lax. He timed it so the trainers on the balcony were focusing elsewhere, used the force to cause a weight to drop from its rack against the wall to distract the guard near him, and then he was through. There was a large hangar. Mandalorian gunships and smaller, more agile craft were all sitting around. In the ceiling was a large hole which was covered in a rolled-out desert camo netting. It let little dots of sunlight beat down. That was all he got to see before he was tackled to the ground by the guard and other Death Watch members. He was dragged roughly back into the training room. His squad was standing stiffly at attention to one side. Corinth looked disappointed but wry, while Maru looked resigned. Zare and Yora were glaring at him. Malia stared off into space, not seeming to register what was going on. Obi-Wan hadn't heard her speak all day. Everyone else in the room was carefully avoiding looking at them. Obi-Wan was held there by 2 adults until a man in pure black armor made his way across the room. From the straightening of everyone with hands on chests as he passed, and the verdate railing behind him, this was Torre Vizsla. He had messy black hair and a narrow face. Obi-Wan's eyes were drawn to the man's waist, where a lightsaber, identical to the one worn by Master Vizsla's holocron, hung. The Darksaber.
"Look at me," said Vizsla. His face was angry. "Do you know what the punishment is for trying to escape?"
"Do you know what the punishment is for torturing children?" asked Obi-Wan. Vizsla snarled and backhanded him. "Ow!"
"And I wasn't trying to escape," said Obi-Wan. "I just wanted to see what was on the other side of that door."
Of course, he had been scouting in preparation for escape.
"You were using that force, Osik. That stops today."
There was absolutely no emotion in his eyes as he looked behind Obi-Wan.
"Punish him,"
he said, but his people didn't move. Instead, Corinth stepped forward. He showed absolutely no emotion on his face when he stepped up to Obi-Wan, though in the Force he was radiating apology. His punches hurt, but they avoided the area around his heart and all the important organs. Unfortunately, that meant he was mostly hitting Obi-Wan in the stomach and gut. Obi-Wan turned his head and threw up all over the boots of one of the people holding him. You could just faintly hear them give a grunt of disgust through their helmet.
"So much for the famed Jedi endurance,"
said Tor, looking amused at his suffering. Obi-Wan wiped the bile away from his lips with the back of his hand.
"This is nothing."
"Did I tell you to stop?"
asked Vizsla of Corinth. Corinth bit his lip but kept punching until Obi-Wan lost track of how many. Only when he hung limp in the Death Watch member's arms was Corinth told to stop.
"Don't make me regret keeping him alive, Jetty,"
warned Vizsla.
"Now, what did you find on Mandalore?"
he demanded. Obi-Wan blinked at the change of subject.
"I found plenty of things on Mandalore."
Vizsla drove his fist into Obi-Wan's stomach.
"Ow!"
The edge of the man's handplate was definitely going to leave a bruise on all his bruises.
"There were rumors about Vizsla's temple. My loyal Verde tell me there was a building they didn't investigate near where they took you."
Vizsla sounded rather annoyed by the fact.
"I'm afraid I wasn't able to look around much before they kidnapped me,"
said Obi-Wan. He braced himself for the blow that was coming. This time Vizsla's fist hit his face. The pain didn't matter, though. He certainly wasn't going to reveal the existence of Torre Vizsla's holocron to Death Watch no matter what they did.
He had probably failed his Vergoten by now, but on the off chance he hadn't, he'd protect what he learned until his last breath. "It was just an old building," he said.
Vizsla didn't look satisfied, but he dropped the subject. He was studying Obi-Wan with his dead eyes.
"We don't have any force restraints, but we don't need them,"
he said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. This was a man who enjoyed causing pain to those around him.
"If you do anything, and I mean anything, that makes your trainers think you are using the Force, you will be punished."
"You do realize Force use is often instinctual?"
asked Obi-Wan, trying for some leeway. He wasn't going to back down from whatever painful punishment Vizsla threw his way, but his few weeks away from the temple meant he was well aware that non-Force users often had no idea Jedi were using the Force.
"I see you need a demonstration."
There was malicious glee in the air from not just Vizsla, but the line of Death Watch Verde behind him. Vizsla gestured one of them forward. Obi-Wan braced himself, but was surprised when they passed him to stand in front of Maru. They studied Maru for a moment before brutally and systematically slamming their fists into Maru's chest and then shoulders when Maru doubled over in agony. The rest of the squad cried out in protest with Obi-Wan, though Maru himself remained silent and defiant. Obi-Wan only had time to try to take one step towards him before it was over, and the Death Watch Verd stepped back. Corinth rushed to Maru's side, but Vizsla barked a command of something in Mandoa, which Obi-Wan didn't know. It made Corinth straighten up and fall back in line.
"Every time you use the Force, one of your squad will be beaten. Try to escape and I kill one of them."
Vizsla stepped forward, grabbed Maru's hand, and casually bent back one of his fingers. The snap from the finger breaking sounded so loud, Maru let out a whimper as Vizsla smiled viciously at Obi-Wan.
"That was for your non-escape attempt today. Any questions?"
He needed to redirect that anger back at him, rather than his squad, and not give in to his own surging anger at these bastards.
"Why does your version of the riddle now repeat Death Watch twice? Did you think people would forget it?"
Obi-Wan asked. Vizsla punched him in the face again.
"Throw him in the pit,"
he ordered. Obi-Wan was not sure where they dragged him after that. His vision was a bit blurry from all the hits, and his stomach was still churning. He was forced to climb down a ladder, but at the bottom there was no hatch or a next floor. Not even a room. Just the cool rock that made up the walls of the mine. The hatch was closed above him, plunging him into darkness and almost completely muffling the Force. He settled cross-legged, his knees brushing the walls. Despite the muffling, he was going to meditate. Maybe if he cast his focus beyond the walls of Beskar Or, he'd be able to find something beyond them. If he was lucky, the Force would show him the way to escape. And if he wasn't, well, he grimaced. Obi-Wan had to admit that threatening to kill his squad mates was an effective deterrent. As a Jedi, he could endure the pain, but he didn't want the others to be punished for his actions. Obi-Wan breathed out, letting some of his worries and pain flow outwards. At least he knew that the true Mandalorians, the Jedi, and his boar were almost certainly working to rescue him by this point. Until then, there was only one thing for it. He'd have to escape with the entire squad.